Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Ahmad Rayan Khan here. Today, I am honored and fan-struck because we have the founder of Board and Beyond with us, Dr. Jason Ryan. Please welcome Dr. I welcome Dr. Jason Ryan, and I don't think he needs any introduction from me. I would, without further ado, request him to talk a little bit about his journey, and then we will get along with the questions. Thanks a lot, Dr. Ryan. Thanks a lot for joining.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Can you please tell us a little bit about how a cardiologist, uh, cardiology is super busy field, uh, how a cardiologist transformed himself into a medical educator and then started writing books and lectures. Can you please
Sure.
briefly describe that?
Gladly. I be Boards and Beyond launched in 2014. Actually, in a few days, June 1st, will be a 10-year anniversary, believe it or not, of the website. Um, and so back in 2014, I was practicing cardiology at the University of Connecticut. I was also teaching medical students. I gave some lectures in the first 2 years. And I'd always liked to teach. I had been a chief resident during my internal medicine residency in Boston, and I had all these PowerPoint slides of different topics that I used to just take out on the wards and say, what do you want to talk about? Let's talk about heart failure. Let's talk about hypercalcemia. I had all these little short talks put together. And so in 2014, a student came to my clinic shadowing me, and he showed me Pathoma. And all the UConn students were learning from Pathoma. And I was blown away because that's a pathologist in Chicago, but yet everyone at UConn was learning from him.
Mhm,
The videos were very straightforward and simple. I sort of had a picture in my mind that videos were complicated to make.
mhm,
You needed a studio and lighting, and but Hussein Sattar makes these great videos. I
mhm.
think his teaching style is similar to mine, simple PowerPoints and a pen. And basically the power is not the visual of the video so much as it's the explanation. It's the words he
Absolutely.
chooses to put the medical science into plain language. And that's exactly what I love to do. So that was sort of a light bulb moment. And I took all these PowerPoint slide decks I had on my hard drive and I started recording videos. I launched it with 44 videos in cardiology. And then over time added more videos. And of course, in the beginning, it took forever to catch on. It wasn't very popular until more students had heard about it. I had to give it away for free a lot in the beginning, but here we are 10 years later, and it has all these hundreds of videos, and now we've added a Q bank and these other things.
Awesome. So that is very interesting to know because Pathoma, when I was a medical student, we actually used to see the lectures and then it was also compiled in the form of the book. And I found it very helpful. So it's really interesting to know that Dr. Hassan Sattar was the light bulb moment for you or the
Really,
inspiration.
he really
Wow.
was. Yeah. I mean, I
Awesome.
saw that and I thought, wow, I thought his videos were great, and I thought I can make videos like that on my topics. I mean, he's a pathologist, so the topics are focused on pathology, but
Yeah.
I could make videos like that on EKGs and heart failure and arrhythmias and all the things that, I used to teach and I like to teach.
Yeah, absolutely. Wonderful. So, when I posted about our podcast, a lot of people sent me questions. So, with your permission, is it okay to start with the questions?
Sure, of course.
All right. So, the one of the biggest questions, this is on the minds of a lot of medical students, especially the international medical graduates. So, since the USMLE and NBME have they have made the step one pass fail, uh, so there has been a downward spiral trend where more people are failing, and I think recently the stats were shared as well that the pass rate of USMLE step one has gone down, and I think it has gone dropped down to 93% if I'm not wrong, and more so with IMG. Uh, I would ask, uh, in your opinion, what could be the reason for that?
Sure. Yeah, sure. No, that's a great question. So when I give talks in person, like grand round talks on, medical education and step one, I bring two copies of First Aid for the Boards. I have the copy from 1997 when I was in medical school and the copy from 2023. So in 1997, First Aid for the Boards which, if your listeners don't know, is a book that basically tells you everything you need to know for the step one exam.
Mhm.
It was about 300 pages when I took it. It's now about 850 pages. So
Okay.
what's happened? So when I was in medical school, the treatment for heart failure was beta blocker ACE inhibitor. That was it.
Mhm.
Now today it's beta blocker, ACE inhibitor, angiotensin receptor blocker, spironolactone, defibrillator, IV pacer. So, and that's just one condition, heart failure. So the treatment and our understanding of all these diseases basically just increases year after year after year. And as far as I'm aware, there's been no effort to cap the knowledge base for step one. You have to know it all. It's basically agreed that highly clinically things are off the test, high level clinical decision making, but all the basic science that's out there for all these disorders is required learning for a closed book test that you have to memorize. So I think the test has gotten almost to the point of being impossible, and someday it may reach that point. But this was masked when the test was scored because the score was so important that everyone started studying a year, 18 months, 2 years in advance. And every spare moment, they were doing flashcards and practice questions. And so even though the test was growing and growing and growing in complexity, we didn't sort of appreciate that as much because students kept passing. And that's because the scored exam drove them to study to insane amounts of studying. So then the test went pass fail with the goal of reducing stress. But in fact, what happened is students said, okay, well, now it's pass fail. I don't need to study every waking moment for 2 years for this test. I'll start studying a month or 2 months before, and I should pass it. And you can't. The test
Mhm.
is too big. So I really think passing this test takes around 6 months of studying most days of the week for it, give
Oh.
or take. Some students might be able to prepare in less, some students
Mhm.
might need more time. But if you're at a medical school where they give you 6 weeks of dedicated study time and you don't begin your preparation until those 6 weeks, you're probably not going to have enough time to get through all the content on this exam.
And that I think that's a very valid point, and I totally agree that because the especially for IMGs, I think it was like a race that in order to make yourself a very competitive candidate, you have to score above 250. And
Right.
I mean, more recently, it was like even 260, and people were actually getting it. And because again, for a lot of IMGs, because we don't have to take the USMLE during our med school, so some of the IMGs had some luxury of time where after graduation they would
Right.
like sit or take a lighter job and then dedicate, uh, give dedicated like 1 year or 8 months time to prepare for step one. So that is very important. Okay. Now, I would also ask, so I would give my personal example. So, when I was in my med school, I was not very good at basic sciences. I personally found them difficult to comprehend, like more like on the drier side. I like physiology and pharmacology, but something like anatomy, they did not resonate with me. So I used like the shortest possible books to pass those professional. So in Pakistan and India, so there's the med school is 5 years, and after every year, most of the time you have to take those professional end of year exam in order to uh, in order to graduate to the next class.
Huh.
Like from first year to second year, in some places now they have come out with a semester system where they would have
Okay.
semester exams, but those exams are pretty solid because you have to pass them, otherwise you have to repeat the class that 1 year. So I use like the shortest possible books for the anatomy because at my time back in uh, uh 2007 8, people were using like for anatomy the Gray's Anatomy, the big anatomy. For physiology they were using Guyton and Hall, so they were using like pretty solid big British books. So I used to even read Kaplan's at that time. So when I started preparing for USMLE step 1, I found it very difficult because I did not have, I think, the basic concepts right because I studied enough to pass those exams, but I felt that I did not make my concepts, the basic concepts were not clear. So I think I suffered, and I did use some video lectures. I did read the books, but I felt that I never got a good grasp of it, and I did not score really well. I was able to pass, but my score was less as compared to CK that I felt was more clinical and it was easy. So, what would be your recommendation for people like, especially people like me, who in their med schools did not do a good job at studying the basic sciences?
Yeah, so the good news now is that there are so many resources like Boards and Beyond that can help someone like you. I was in the same boat as you when I studied for step one. My only study tool was Robbins pathology. I mean, I read it, I highlighted it, I would draw pathways on the boards, but I had no way to have someone explain that information to me in easily digestible language. And then I also didn't have any Q banks. So, I went into the exam really unfamiliar with using that information in a question-based format. So, flash forward now, the good news for the current generation of doctors is I think it's easier than ever to learn medical science. You have Boards and Beyond, there's competitors to Boards and Beyond, all sorts of resources that will explain the medical science to you in a very basic way. Because textbooks are great when you already know something. You can go read it. It's vetted. The information's usually highly accurate. It's referenced. But if you don't know anything yet, it's very hard to start with a chapter in Robbins to learn it for the first time. So you can come to Boards and Beyond, and I'll explain to you what anemia is in basic sentences, and then you can read Robbins later. So if you're not good on the basic sciences, you need to find one of these foundational resources that will teach it to you, like Boards and Beyond, and learn it there. And then, you once you have a foundation, I think practice questions are really helpful because
Mhm.
you can understand that anemia causes fatigue, but until you read a question of a fatigued person and they force you to figure out that it's coming from anemia,
Mhm.
you haven't really manipulated that information in your mind the way you're going to need to do on exams and even with patients later on. So, now you can build your foundation outside your medical school with online resources and you can do these question banks. And I think it's such a better way to get you ready. And that's why before the test went pass fail, the scores were going through the roof.
Yeah.
Scores that would have been off the charts when I was in school. Students would be in tears because their score wasn't high enough. They'd say, "Oh, I got a 238." And to me, a 238 is the highest score I've ever heard back when I
Hmm.
was in school. And people would be
Exactly.
in tears. And that's because these resources have prepared you better for the test. So, the average USMLE score when I took it was a 213. And before it went past fail, I think the mean was in the 230s somewhere. The
Yeah.
mean score was,
Yeah.
and I think I don't think it's because the test got easier. That's because the students taking it are better prepared. You guys know this information better than I did when I took it. You've practiced questions, and so you score higher.
Okay. Uh, some of my discussions with the people who recently took USMLE Step One was so what they are saying, and I don't necessarily agree, and that's why I'm asking you. They say that okay, start your preparation with a Q bank, and you can read what you feel that you are not strong at. But I when I did that, I mean, again, it was years back. I did not do it. What do you think about like starting, as you were saying, starting with the concepts, textbook, watching videos, and then Q bank, or you can start both together, or just start Q bank.
Yeah, great question. So the first thing I have to say is uh, students have often asked me for the recipe to prepare for step one, and I wish I could give it to you. I've seen so many different approaches to studying. So what I tell you is what I've seen work the most, but that doesn't mean it will work for you. And so if something works for you, you can do it. Personally, I don't think it makes sense to do questions without a foundation. You will get them all wrong and then you will try to backlearn the information by reading the explanation. But if the explanation contains all these terms you're not familiar with from medical science, and you just don't know the basics, you don't have an image in your head of how the whole process works that they're testing, I think it's going to be hard to learn. So I think questions are better used after you have some foundation. You understand what renal failure is. Then you can go answer questions about renal failure. But I'll also say this, I think getting questions wrong is part of building your foundation. And I think people need to appreciate that. So if you watch, again, let's say you watch my video on renal failure and you go do questions on renal failure, you're going to get them wrong because you've never used that information, manipulated it in your mind to solve a problem. You've just heard it from me and it makes sense. So building your foundation with some kind of video or basic resource and then getting questions wrong for a little while is the perfect way to build your foundation. After that, you have a strong foundation, and then you can go in and start filling in details, reinforcing, trying to remember things. That's the way. This is the way I've seen work for the most people. But like I said, everybody's different.
Absolutely, absolutely. And again, there's no set duration, but for international medical graduates who, of course, have to also take those exams, the professional exams in their med school. Uh, what would be your recommendation, even a ballpark for the duration they should spend at least a minimum amount of time to prepare for step one now so that they pass?
Yeah. So assuming your med school gave you a reasonable foundation, you understand what DNA is, you understand what the heart and the kidneys and the lungs all do, and some of the basic concepts. Assuming you've got that from your med school, I think again, this is a ballpark. Everybody's different, but I think about 6 months is what it takes to get ready for this test. 6 months where you study most days of the week, not 20 and not all day long, 12 or 14 hours, but you're putting in 5, 6, 7 hours of studying each day, majority of days of the week for about
Mhm.
6 months. That's what it takes to get ready.
Okay.
Um, the other thing I'll say is what you need to do to get ready changes the closer you get to the exam. So if
Mhm.
you're far away from the exam and you memorize every DNA and RNA virus, you're not going to remember that when the exam comes 6 or 8 months
Absolutely.
later. It's just going to spill out of your head. This is the way our brains work. So, when you're far out, you want to say, do I understand just what viruses are in general? Do I understand what DNA is, what RNA is, how some of those processes work? The only time it's really worth memorizing those things is probably 4 to 6 weeks before the test. That's when it's likely to stick.
Mhm.
So start far out, big principles, big picture, get the idea of how things work, get the idea of what types of questions you'll see. And then when you get closer to the exam, that's where you really can start memorizing things.
Okay. So especially the some of the pharmacology stuff, microbiology, anatomy. So what you're saying is that we may have to do multiple times, and especially more focus on those cramming kind of a things like 4 to 6 weeks prior to the exam because our brain works in a way that we can only retain so much.
Yeah, I mean, if you're 4 weeks away and you get a question wrong about an RNA virus, you might want to take out a whiteboard and write out all the names of the RNA and DNA viruses and come up with a mnemonic that will help you memorize it. I think it makes sense to do that 4 weeks before the
Absolutely.
exam. If your exam's in 6 months, I don't think that's a good use of your time. I think you're just spinning your wheels if you do that. You're not going to remember all that 6 months from now. Okay, you got the question wrong, but you generally know what RNA and DNA viruses are. Let it go. It's okay. You got it wrong. It's just practice. Move along. Make sure you got the big picture. I do think, especially there are some students who really love to memorize, and they're far away from the exam and they're cramming all these details in their head. And again, maybe it works for them. Everybody's different, but I think that's not a good use of your time.
Absolutely. Uh, I have a question so about a certain book. So when I was preparing, first aid was considered like very important for all the steps, especially step one. They used to say that first aid is like the Bible of step one exam. And again, times have changed. What in your opinion, what is the significance of first aid book these days for step one exam?
I still think that book is the best place to figure out what you need to know.
Mhm.
Because for any topic, let's say it's heart failure. I mean, there's volumes written about heart failure. You can fill up an entire library with books about heart failure. But
Mhm.
what do you need to know for step one? What are the important things?
Mhm.
And sometimes even your faculty don't know. They may be involved in research and they think this little niche area is the most important.
Yeah.
They could be I've had some teachers who are liver transplant doctors. They think everything's about transplanting livers. But for step one, they're not going to ask you anything about liver transplant. They want you to know the cell types and the zones of all the different processing reactions. So you need first aid to ground you in what you need to know. It's hard to learn from it, though. I mean, it's really just a list of things to know. It has some good mnemonics and drawings, and some people, and this is how I made Boards and Beyond. I took a page in first aid and I made a video out of it. And then I took another page and I made a video out of it because I think what first aid covers is important stuff clinically. You just need it explained to you in plain English, and there isn't enough room in the book to do that.
Absolutely. And I think that's what a lot of people I think would do is nowadays that they would read first aid, they would listen or see your lectures or others similar, and then they would make notes on first aid. That's what I have been told by the students who are recently taking the exams.
That's right. And you may know that First Aid has gone digital, so it has a website now with all the pages, and you can highlight and annotate and mark. And now that McGraw-Hill owns Boards and Beyond and First Aid, they're all going to be linked. So you can watch a video and click and jump to the first aid page
Oh, wow.
digitally that goes along with it, and vice versa. And so the idea here is to integrate Boards and Beyond. I mean, the videos were always made around first aid, but it was around the print version. Now you're going to have access to this digital version online
Okay.
where you can jump back and forth from video to page in first aid and so forth.
That's awesome. So it's like a package where you can get both.
Both, yeah.
Oh, wow. That
Like
is
you'll be watching a video and right next to it, it'll say like digital first aid reference for this video, and you click it and it'll take you to all
oh,
the parts in first aid. I
wow.
mean, you could do that yourself with the print version. We used to list the pages in the print book below the
Hmm.
video, and you could go turn to them
Okay.
and follow along. But you can still do that if you want. But now they'll have this digital online first aid that you
Okay.
can go to and annotate and save your notes and everything like that.
Okay. Wow. That's really amazing. That's really amazing.
I've seen the beta testing and I think it's amazing. I think it's going to be a game changer because students have always loved first aid. It's a great way to just
Hmm.
ground, like I said, it's a great way to ground yourself and know
Hmm.
what's important. But after they watch a video, they want to go back to first aid and say, do I understand everything listed in
Hmm.
first aid? You know, did I get that from the video? Did I miss anything?
Hmm.
And now to be able to just do that at the click of the button, I think is going to be the future.
Wonderful. And do you know when would they release that?
I think it's coming out next month.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah,
That's
June.
awesome. I
Yeah.
mean, that is something that when I was preparing, if I had that, I mean, at that time we
Right.
did not have that much advancements anyway.
Right. I would have loved it. I mean, I made those videos to be the kind of videos I would have wanted as a student, somebody using plain language to explain to me the science at just the level I needed. And then I also used first aid and to have them both together digitally, I
Hmm.
think is going to be fantastic. When it comes out, there'll be lots of advertising. I'm sure you'll hear about it, but it's going to
Okay.
come out any day now.
Wonderful. Dr. Ryan, I when I see I follow your X account very closely, and the best thing about your X account, what I have seen is that you also talk a lot about medical education itself, the approach of students, the approach of teachers, and I that's so what I would ask you is what I have noticed more recently that there's not a lot of emphasis when MS3, MS4 are rotating with us on our clinical side. There's not a lot of focus on appreciating a student when a student does really something really well. I want to ask you about that. What do you think could be a potential reason behind it? And if we really appreciate students on something they're doing well, does that help them in terms of their learning?
Yeah, I think students love to be appreciated. They love to be complimented for things that they do. In the third and fourth years, I'm an advisor to students. One of the biggest complaints I hear is just that they're sort of forgotten. You know, the service is so busy, they get told to go read or just stay quiet and stand behind me. Um, and so I think they love to be appreciated in the third and fourth year. I think more of that would be great for their well-being.
Okay. And Dr. Ryan, if as a preceptor, I feel that a student is lacking in some area, what would be the best way to give the feedback? Because I have always found it difficult to maintain a balance where you give a feedback in a more constructive way so that also student realizes that they can improve, but also making sure that you just not like just bombard them with information that they don't know.
Yeah, I wish I had a good answer to this question. Giving feedback, constructive critical feedback is, I think, one of the hardest things to do as a medical educator. It's not easy. Also, the way it's received is so different from student to student. I mean, you can imagine A student who's very confident, had a lot of good experiences, can probably hear some critical feedback and roll it into improving. A student who's been, having a hard time and getting beaten down may be very defensive when you bring up a piece of constructive criticism. So it's not easy. Um, but the cardiology center at UConn is founded by Jim Calhoun, the famous basketball coach for UConn, and he comes around a lot. And he always says, he tells his players, I criticize you because I care about you and I want you to be the best. If I didn't care about you, I would never criticize you. Why would I bother even wasting my time on you? So I try to, when I give, and I'm by no means am I perfect at it, but I try to give critical feedback along the lines of, I'm telling you this because I want you to be great. And I think you can be great. And here's some things you can do that I think will help you achieve your full potential. It's still not easy. People get defensive. They don't like to hear criticisms. And I'm aware that I may be subjective. I may be asking them to do something that the next preceptor may not care about at all. So it's not easy, but I try to frame it around the idea of making them into their best selves.
Absolutely. Uh, I would ask you about this recent issue with the USMLE score invalidation, where, of course, there were some anomalous pattern detected, and I mean, people were scoring. I mean, I was honestly surprised as well. People were scoring 270s, 280s, which I had never heard of, and of course,
No.
there was a whole scenario. Uh, as a medical educator, what was when you found out? What was your take on it? And again, in your personal opinion, did the NBME and USMLE handle the situation pretty well?
Uh, Boy, that's a great question. The first thought I had when I heard about it is I'm not totally surprised because
Mm,
these tests are supposed to just be aptitude tests. Like, have you learned the basic amount to be a
mm,
physician? That's it. And we've turned them into this rule yardstick for determining how capable you are.
yeah.
And that's really kind of crazy that we put so much emphasis on this test. So I wasn't surprised to hear that there might have been some people cheating. As far as how they handled it, I don't really have an opinion. I mean, they had to come out with their evidence that they had on hand and show
Mm,
it. Unfortunately, that evidence targeted a couple of countries
mm,
and therefore gave the unintended impression that those countries might be full of cheaters when surely they're not.
mm.
Um, so it's a big, messy sort of thing. And I hope they come out with some sort of systematic overview of everybody to just weed out all the cheating that they can find and make it clear that's probably not, I'm sure it's not coming from just one or two places. If it were happening there, it's happening in other places too.
Yeah, and I think as a medical educator, that was my concern that it is something when even I was preparing, we knew that there were some places that had information about some questions.
Right.
Uh, I think that that was primarily based on like recalls, but I think that more recently, what allegedly what was happening is that they had the whole stem of questions, which
Yeah.
of course is way different. I'm not saying that even recall is like legit or legal, but then that is something that if I take an exam, someone asks me, I mean, there is only so much you can remember, and there is only so much you can tell. But yeah, yeah, that was, I think, the concern which I personally felt was that in the court documents they presented when one of the students filed a lawsuit, they had mentioned few countries, but then at the end of the day, until so far, only country applicants from two countries have been subjected to that invalidation, which did leave a bad taste in the mouth of some program directors. Because if I'm a program director, I would be a little cautious about ranking an applicant
Yeah.
from that country, keeping in mind that down the line the scores may get invalidated. So I think yeah, that was some the concern which I had and some other people had in their minds.
Yeah.
So
I agree. I understand.
so we would try to wrap up the session. I had a few more quick questions about. So, since they have made step one pass and fail, uh, the focus has turned entirely to CK. That is like the main objective measure where you have to take that exam. In your opinion, how has that impacted IMG's chances of getting into more competitive specialties? Because again, IMGs were trying to ace both exams, and if they had like 260, 70 in step one and same in CK, that would give them an edge in terms of getting into more competitive specialties. Now,
Yeah.
I mean, step one is just pass fail. So, in your opinion, how that has impacted their chances of getting into more competitive specialties?
Yeah, good question. So at the University of Connecticut, where I teach, the internal medicine residency recruits a lot of IMGs.
Okay.
Uh, it's just a program that doesn't fill with American medical school graduates for a variety of reasons. There's a lot of competition from New York and Boston and nearby cities. So it's always dependent on IMGs to fill the program. Um, and that was the same before step one was pass fail. And it's the same now that step one is pass fail. So the first thing I usually say to IMGs is there is a demand for you in this country that isn't affected by step one being pass fail or not. It will always be there. So there will always be spots for IMGs. The only thing that's changed is how we evaluate applicants because we used to be able to just look at that step one score and screen using that. And now we no longer can. Your best attribute, if you're an IMG applying for a residency program, is the school where you went to medical school. So, for example, at UConn, there are certain international medical schools that have sent us great residents for years. We know they're good training schools. We know that we can trust their letter writers. And so, if you're an IMG, what I always tell people to do is first look at where the people, the class ahead of you, two classes, three classes, where they went and apply to those programs. Because if the people that went ahead of you have done a good job, they've paved the way for you. And that, in my opinion, is almost as powerful as a high step score. You know, if you're applying to a residency that knows your school in Pakistan or the Philippines or India or South Africa, they're going to look at you seriously. What you're asking is a different thing. So now let's say you're trying to get into a competitive residency that doesn't normally take IMGs or has never taken an IMG from your school. That's a tricky thing no matter what. Even if you're an American grad and you're trying to apply somewhere that's never taken a student from your school, it's going to be tricky. If you're trying to do that, a higher score surely helps. I mean, there's no question. The higher you can get on step two, the better. But other things are going to matter too, like if you have any connections, if you did an observership there, if you've done research in an area that they value. But anytime you're trying to get into a residency that doesn't have a track record of taking people from your school, it's always difficult, whether you're an IMG or an AMG, it doesn't make a difference.
Okay, understand. Okay, understandable. Uh, my second last question to you. Some people talk about red flags, especially for IMDs. If someone fails an exam, they're out of their med school like more than 5 years.
Yeah.
They don't have what they call the US clinical experiences. Again, with you being in the medical education for a long time, I would ask especially about the USMLE step failures. What can someone do in addition to passing that exam on the second attempt? How can they make their applications attractive enough for the program directors to review? Because a lot of time they have filters of exam and their application is just filtered out. What can they do, especially the IMGs, to make themselves competitive enough if they fail an exam?
Yeah. So, yeah, unfortunately, the two biggest red flags are probably having failed a step exam. And like you said, if you're more than 5 years out, it gets harder to match into a program. The US programs prefer more recent grads whose
Mm,
training is they think will be more up to date than someone who maybe trained 10 or 15 years ago. If you failed an exam, the first thing to know is, I mean, all the programs in the US have a range of competitiveness. You know, some programs are some of the most competitive in the world, and some programs don't fill the majority of the years. You know, they're always struggling to fill. So you need to target those less competitive programs that are more likely to take someone who's failed an exam.
mm,
And then the second thing is the best way to get around a failure is for people at a program to know you. There's no easy way for me to tell you to do this, but if you can get to know people at a certain program through an observership, a research position in the lab, and they realize, wow, you're really good, and that step one failure doesn't represent your true ability, you're going to get in there. And that's actually something that even US students use. Like if they don't match in dermatology, they will go and do a research year in someone's lab.
Okay.
And at the end of that research year, they will get ranked very highly to match in dermatology because now they know them and they know they're better than what they saw on their paper application. So those would be my two pieces of advice: to target the
Hmm.
less competitive programs and then try any way you can. And I know it's not easy, but try any way you can to get in through a back door where you can meet people at the program and let them know you. So you're not just an applicant on paper, you're actually a real person they've met.
Absolutely. My last question would be, being such a wonderful medical educator, writer of the books, the lectures, what would be your last advice to students all over the world, especially IMGs who are preparing for USMLE exams? What could be a few things they should focus on?
Yeah, I mean, I I always tell students to not forget this is a service profession. It's about helping others. It's about helping people. And the more you remember that, at least for me, the easier the work is. The more I think about like salary and government health policy and how competitive I am compared to my colleagues and where I stand in the rankings, all those things tend to stress me out. The more I think that we're very lucky to be a part of this profession. We can do amazing things for people in the modern era that we couldn't even do 10 or 20 years ago. The more I think about that, the happier I feel and the easier it makes it for me to study. So when I counsel like the UConn students who are different from IMGs, but still they share some of the same problems and they're just feeling burnt out, I just say to remember, you're here to help people and focus on helping people and try to forget about your UWorld percentage or how many videos you've watched or Anki cards you did, and think about all those patients out there that you can help and use that to drive you to study and to find more enjoyment and satisfaction in your studying.
Wow, that is one of the most beautiful pieces of advice I have ever heard. And personally, I would say that I have actually used that even 3 year out of residency. Sometimes when I'm feeling a little bit down, I still draw inspiration from some of those events during my residency where I felt that I was able to help someone who really needed it. Wow, that is beautiful. Well,
It
thanks a
it
lot.
really Yeah, it really is. The more you can, and I mean, this is sort of a shameless plug, but I wrote this book back here called The Gunner.
Mhm.
It's a satire, so it's a funny story about life in an American medical school. But the underlying theme is that the protagonist keeps getting drawn away from caring for patients by competitiveness, my grades, my board scores, my honors. And she starts to just feel filthy about herself because she's forgotten, that underlying thing, which is all these things are important, of course, matching and board scores and all that. But like the foundation of medicine is caring for others and delivering good care to people in need.
Absolutely, absolutely. That is beautiful. Well, thanks a lot. I really appreciate it. We'll finish our podcast, and we hope and we request that in the future we could have you to appear in a similar podcast again. Thanks a lot, Dr. Ryan.
You're welcome.